What percentage of Mormons actually practiced polygamy in the 19th century? I'm currently in Short Creek, the historical home of the Mormon fundamentalist tradition. Behind me, you'll see the desert of northern Arizona, and if you were to peek around the corner, you would see the gorgeous red rocks of southern Utah. And I was speaking to a group of Mormon polygamists at an informal event a couple nights ago, and this question came up because it's a question that has a lot of baggage and significance, especially in relation to both the LDS and fundamentalist traditions and how they relate to each other. It's also a question that doesn't really have an easy answer. You might hear theories from one side to another. On the low end, you'll hear that only 2% of Mormons practice polygamy. That's a popular number. It's also demonstrably wrong, and I'm going to get to that number in a bit. But addressing this question is a useful exercise or launching point to think about the historian's craft. How do we frame data? How do we ask questions? Who do we include? And so that's what I'm addressing in this video. I'm going to start out by talking about that popular 2% myth that was trotted out by Gordon B. Hinckley in the 1990s, but he was far from alone. And I'll talk about the long history of that number and what it aimed to accomplish. I'll then dig into the complicated numbers related to polygamy in 19th century Utah and why it is so difficult to come to a firm answer. And then I'll conclude that no matter what number you come up with, it probably doesn't give an accurate reflection of how central polygamy was to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Because the significance of polygamy can't really be quantified. And that's what I want to talk about today. So let's dig in. You might be familiar with Gordon B. Hinckley's interview with Larry King shortly after Hinckley became the LDS Church president in 1995. The whole purpose of that interview was to demonstrate that the Latter-day Saints weren't weird. I promise, if you go watch it, that's the focus. And in the midst of that conversation with Larry King, someone with whom Hinckley would develop a very warm and close friendship, the topic of polygamy came up. And this is how Hinckley answered the question.
First, tell me about the church and polygamy. When it started, it allowed it?
When our people came west, they permitted it on a restricted scale.
You could have a certain amount of...
The figures that I have are from between 2% and 5% of our people were involved in it. It was a very limited practice, carefully safeguarded.
There's a few things that I think are worth unpacking from that answer. First, the surrounding conversation around that soundbite, and you can find that whole video on YouTube, by the way. The surrounding conversation was about the criminalization of polygamy in Utah at that moment, while they were talking about Mormon fundamentalists. And so, again, remember that this number is often trotted out as a way to distance Latter-day Saints from the fundamentalists. It's also meant to downplay polygamy. Note his claim that, according to the numbers he has, between 2 and 5% of people were involved, that it was restricted and closely guarded, that it was not commonplace. You can see the clear implication is that polygamy was not as central to 19th century Mormons, and therefore it should not be as central to our idea of the Mormon tradition today, and also that Latter-day Saints are very different from the fundamentalists because obviously they must have higher numbers. Now, that figure, the between 2 and 5%, has a very fascinating history. As far as historians have been able to determine, that figure was first trotted out in the 1880s as the federal government is trying to persecute and prosecute the Latter-day Saints in Utah, throwing polygamists in jail. And a group of Mormon leaders, like George Q. Cannon, were trying to downplay the number of Latter-day Saints who practice in order to insist that, no, you don't need to come in and intervene. Polygamy will actually die on its own. This is a fascinating dynamic that was going on to where, when facing the Saints, Cannon would argue that polygamy is an essential celestial doctrine. It should be practiced. All leaders should practice. And then they would pivot and face the federal government and say that, no, not many are practicing polygamy, so you really don't have to worry about it. The number then appears again during the Reed-Smoot trial between 1903 and 1907, when Reed-Smoot, an LDS apostle who was elected to the United States Senate, prompted this massive investigation and committee discussion in Washington, D.C. over whether the Mormons practiced polygamy. And once again, they tried to downplay, no, it was never that much of a core doctrine. For example, only 2% practice it. Again, misleading, again used for partisan aims. And then finally, the number becomes prominent again after the rise of the Mormon fundamentalist movement, when Latter-day Saint leaders were trying to distance themselves from this historical remnant, this continued perpetual practice of polygamy, showing that they are different from these outlaws in the Mormon tradition who were trying to keep Mormonism alive. So where did they get this figure? Now, the most cynical response that I think has some version of truth is they just made it up, that it was just something to get the government off their back and to prove that Latter-day Saints were monogamous and that polygamy was not central. If we were going to use the most charitable interpretation, however, one might say that if you were to look at all of Utah's population, 2% of them are men who were living with plural wives at that time. Still, even with those boundaries, it's not an accurate number, but if we're looking for a charitable explanation, that seems to be what they're going for. And that actually hints at some of the problems of how we calculate polygamous involvement. By the way, before I go much further, just a reminder that if you enjoy this kind of nerdy content, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. I do deep dives on topics every Monday. I look at modern events and connect the past to the present on Wednesdays, either through politics or media or movies or popular culture. And then on Fridays, I peel back the curtains and we talk about the historian's craft. How do we frame our arguments? Like in this video, I talk with new authors of books. I revisit classic works in the field, or I look at the sources behind historical arguments so that you too can develop the tools of being a historian. And if you want to follow me on other platforms, I suggest subscribing to my free kit newsletter where I send out infrequent notices of links, announcements, videos, and so forth. And you can follow me on different social media channels, especially on Instagram where I do supplemental information. Also, if you live near Provo, a fun event is coming up just in a few days. On Thursday, June 30th at the Bright Building in Provo, Utah, I will be participating in a panel on discussing religious truths in an age of digital misinformation. And the panel includes me, Dan McClellan, as well as Lindsay Hansen Park, and it will be moderated by Blair Hodges. It should be a lot of fun. You can find a link to all the details in the video description, and I hope to see a lot of you there. And if you want to support this channel, and I'm so grateful for the many of you who have chosen to support this channel, you can become a member, where for a nominal fee, you get early access to my videos, you get little icons next to your name when you leave comments, but most importantly, you can feel good about supporting public-facing rigorous scholarship, trying to improve our discussion. And that support enables both me and my producer, Anthony, to put in the time necessary to put these videos together. But that's enough about me. Let's get back to today's topic. So how do you get an accurate count of those practicing polygamy? I mean, even going beyond the problem of catching polygamy in any census taken any year, which isn't very accurate for a number of political reasons, that's probably worth a video at some point. But who do we include, and at what time, and how do we balance it? The 2% number that I mentioned before probably comes from a focus on men. Obviously, that's giving a distorted view of everyone who participates. Notably the women and children who are in polygamous families. So it does reflect the male-centered narrative that you find in most accounts of Mormon history. But so do you include the number of people who are involved in marriages, or do you include, or you just discuss marriages, or do you discuss households? Do you include children, because children are impacted by polygamous families, or are you just looking at spouses? Progeny was the purpose of polygamy, at least dictated by leaders, after all. And more problems include the facts that it often varied drastically by both region and chronology. Region, because there are some areas of Utah where polygamy was much more enforced, largely due to leadership pushing down from the top and then bishops and stake presence pushing at the local level, while there are other areas where polygamy was a bit sparse. And there are some times when there are spikes in polygamous unions, like during the Mormon Reformation of the late 1850s, or during the pushback against the federal government in the 1880s. So some communities and some times were very different than others. And so if you're asking for an overall percentage, it's hard to come up with one that's accurately reflective. And further, when we are looking at how common polygamy was, do we factor in activity levels among Latter-day Saints? Are we looking at the polygamous share within the broader Utah population, or are we looking at the polygamous share of those who are practicing and believing Mormons, not just lay Mormons? Some of the best work on polygamy demographics is done by two historians, Catherine Danes, who wrote the book More Wives Than One, The Transformation of the Mormon Marriage System, which goes into a lot of statistics and quantifiable data that I strongly recommend. The other is Ben Benyon, who wrote a series of articles as well as a couple books that really dig into the statistics of polygamy. And they emphasize the variety of the polygamous numbers across the Utah territory. But what they come down to, if you look at their numbers together, and I promise I'm now getting to actual numbers if you're curious, if you were to average, and again, this is misleading because it differs by decade and by region, but if you were to come up with a common average, about 20 to 30% of marriages that took place in Utah involved plural spouse, and about 30 to 40% of people in Utah were somehow connected to a polygamous family, either as a husband or one of the wives or as one of the children. Now, that number, 30 to 40% of households, is also notable because those are also the same figures of the percentage of Mormons who paid a full tithing, who served missions, or were sealed in a temple. In other words, the percentages line up to where if you were a fully active, believing, and dedicated Latter-day Saints, you were more likely than not a polygamist. And that's why the lower numbers just don't really reflect the actuality. But in the end, I don't think any number would fully suffice in capturing how central polygamy was to the Latter-day Saints. And that's because I don't think you can quantify the significance of polygamy to the Mormon community in the 19th century. It goes beyond numbers and toward their theological mindset, both because of the theological teachings coming down from leadership, as well as the expectations and example produced by leadership that reflects a sense of what devotion to the Latter-day Saint cause meant. It was taught as a foundational doctrine in the midst of their fight with the government over polygamy in the 1870s, as the Reynolds v. United States case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Daniel Wells, who was a counselor in the First Presidency, said that if they, quote, failed to obey polygamy, they would be under condemnation and would be clipped in their glory in the worlds to come. Speaking of individual Latter-day Saints, that there is a loss in their spiritual stature if they did not practice polygamy. Another counselor in the First Presidency, Joseph F. Smith, who would later be a prophet himself, protested during this time against what he called the false idea that monogamy would be enough for a Latter-day Saint to achieve the highest glory, and that, quote, whoever imagined that he could obtain the fullness of the blessings pertaining to the celestial law by complying with only a portion of its conditions has deceived himself. He cannot do it. Now, I'll quickly add that the idea that polygamy was necessary for the highest exalted order was inconsistent. Sometimes they taught that polygamy wasn't required, but many times they did. And the fact that that was a live option, the fact that that was insisted by some church leaders throughout that period shows how central it was. And further, beyond just the teachings, there's the examples of what church leaders were doing, especially during the 1880s, although you found this earlier on as well. Leaders were expected to practice polygamy because a person of that stature was expected to follow the fullness of God's law. George Q. Cannon, a counselor in the First Presidency, emphasized that he did, quote, not feel like holding up his hand to sustain anyone in a presiding office over any portion of the people who had not entered into the patriarchal order of marriage, and that anyone who is capable, quote, must have more than one wife at a time in order to obey that law. In fact, in 1882, John Taylor issued a revelation that said that anyone who held a priesthood leadership calling had to practice polygamy. And the through line was that believing in polygamy was not enough. You had to actually practice it. And that shows how central it was to their teaching, a dynamic that can't be captured in any statistical figure. So again, I hope this discussion, and at least some of the figures and questions and quotes, demonstrate my contention that you can't quantify the significance of polygamy to the Mormon tradition. And that some of these numbers that are trotted out, the low end of the 2 to 5%, like Gordon B. Hinckley did, just demonstrate not a reality, but a failure to reckon with the past, either in trying to downplay polygamy's significance to the tradition or distance the Latter-day Saint Church from the fundamentalists. And remember, the percentage of households in territorial Utah when Mormons were practicing polygamy, the percentage of households that were involved in polygamy were similar to the percentage of households that had temple recommends. It's probably also similar to the percentage of Mormons today who have temple recommends. In other words, it was expected for full members to follow the fullness of God's glory as they described, even if that language sometimes ebbed and flowed throughout the decade. I hope this also demonstrates the importance of historical research to both debunk myths as well as to disrupt our common perceptions of things and recognize the complexity and the necessity of deeper dissection. I hope you found this useful. If so, please hit the like button, share with others so we can broaden the discussion, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet, and become a member if you want to give back. History has never been more relevant than it is today because it allows us to look at the past, how it's connected to the present, and how some of these traditional myths don't really hold up to reality.